Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I'm your hard-working but indefatigable teacher, Mr. Burton. You will need to watch this video and take notes as you go. You may need to watch certain parts of the video a few times to ensure complete understanding. This is your homework and I will check your notes tomorrow before we get started. I hope you learned something.
Hello and welcome to today's lesson. Today is our final installment in our ASAD equilibrium unit of the course. This time specifically looking at the Keynesian ASAD equilibrium. Let's make a distinction quickly between the Keynesian and the monetarist ADAS models. In the monetarist theory, which we've been looking at, the economy can never be stuck in a deflationary gap. Factor prices adjust automatically to the changes in demand of firms for those resources. So we have long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and short run aggregate supply. The long run equilibrium is 0.1. Long run aggregate supply equals short run aggregate supply 1 equals aggregate demand 1. If we get a shift in aggregate demand, all that happens is we get a change in the resource prices that the firms are using. So there'll be a price level decrease initially and a shift along the short run aggregate supply curve from 1 to 2, 0.1 to 0.2, and we get a temporary output gap opening there, the deflationary gap, where Y1 is less than YF, the full level of employment at that output level. And we know that firms will make adjustments to this. The cost of productions are decreasing, increased profitability, they will increase supply quickly and instantaneously, automatically, and the price level will adjust downwards further. So these things happen automatically in the monetarist model. In the Keynesian model, high levels of unemployment can persist for long periods of time if there is insufficient aggregate demand. So it's not inflexible resources market, the factors of production that cause unemployment, but it's low levels of expenditure, the low levels of AD. And remember, AD equals consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus export expenditure by foreigners, lesser imports that the domestic buyers are producing. In the Keynesian model, we have got this aggregate supply curve. At the vertical part of the aggregate supply curve, that's the full level of employment, the level of output that leads to full employment, and where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply, we get determines where real GDP is. In this instance, it's a deflationary gap. Y1 is less than the full level of output of employment level. So economies can get stuck here. There's nothing that says in a Keynesian model that resource prices have to adjust automatically. They can get trapped in a deflationary gap for long periods of time without ever achieving the full employment level of output, which we know as YF. Our Keynesian ADAS model. The deflationary gap. Even if the prices of resources adjust downwards, firms need not necessarily employ more resources, for example by hiring more labour as wage rates fall or increasing investment as interest rates decrease. If there's not sufficient demand in the economy for the goods and services that these firms are producing, they're not going to produce anymore. Why expand your output if there's no demand, insufficient demand in the economy? So decreasing expenditure by firms and consumers characterise recessions, and firms in recessions invest less in capital goods and consumers spend less on goods and services as incomes for both consumers and producers fall, and that's in line with a decreased national output, i.e. real GDP. And what this does, it causes aggregate demand to fall even further. So in a recessionary or deflationary gap, we can have it widen even further as consumers spend less, firms invest less, and that spending decreases aggregate demand further. And as aggregate demand falls, real output falls in line with that, and that reduces incomes further. Insufficient aggregate demand causes unemployment. So a key statement here, an essential statement: Keynesians state that output is largely determined by aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is a driving factor of how much firms are producing in the economy. So if we can boost aggregate demand, this becomes a solution to unemployment in an economy. Increase in aggregate demand leads to increases in the supply of goods and services, and this increases employment of the factors of production, including labour and the wages, which will increase real incomes, increase real output, boosting real GDP. So if we can boost aggregate demand, we can close that deflationary gap. We can get the economy producing at the full employment level of output, YF there. However, if firms are not investing and consumers are not purchasing goods and services, then the government is going to need to step in to increase its expenditure and boost aggregate demand this way. So we know if we get an increase in government spending, we get an increase in aggregate demand. And without such intervention, recessions in an economy can be long, they can be deep, and this can lead to long-term unemployment of the factors of production. And if this happens, if our factors of production are not being used, it can lead to decreased productivity of these factors. So workers are going to lose their skills as they are unemployed, and capital soon becomes dated and obsolete. Now, the Keynesians argue that governments should be running expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy is where government spending exceeds government revenues from taxation when there's a deflationary gap, and a contractionary fiscal policy when there's an inflationary gap. Expansionary fiscal policy, when government expenditure in the form of tax cuts, transfer payments, rebates and increased government spending is greater than the revenue from taxes, income from state-owned enterprises, etc. That's expansionary. Now, if a government's running an expansionary fiscal policy by increasing transfer payments to household or reducing personal and business income taxes, then real disposable incomes for consumers are going, and firms will increase. With increased incomes comes increased demand for goods and services, and aggregate demand is going to increase. It will shift right. And as aggregate demand increases, firms then going to need to employ more resources, more of those factors of production to meet the increased demand for their goods and services. And as this happens, unemployment in the economy falls, and the economy moves to the full employment level of output at YF. Increasing aggregate demand does not simply increase inflation necessarily, as the monetarists would theorize. So in the monetarist model of aggregate supply and demand, any increase in aggregate demand will lead to inflation, and if inflation we're defining as a sustained increase in the average price levels of goods and services in the economy, and that's shown as an increase in the price level So we have deflationary gap here, which the monetarists would argue is very short-lived. The economy automatically adjusts to the long-run aggregate supply level of output at YF. In the monetarist model, the deflationary gap is automatically closed. The economy achieves that second point without any government intervention whatsoever. And if the government did try to boost real GDP by increasing government spending to increase aggregate demand, we would have an inflationary gap opening where YF is less than the current level of output, and all this would do would be to boost inflation, increase the price level in the economy. So as the government tried to boost aggregate demand past the long run aggregate supply, that full level of employment, that level of output which produces full employment of resources, price level increases. Now, any attempt by the government to increase AD by moving the economy past YF to 3 automatically leads to higher prices, that second price level, and return to YF at 0.4 there, which is its long run equilibrium of full employment level of output. So that's the monetarist model. Let's have a look at the Keynesian model and inflation. Right, low levels of output here. We have Y1, the current level of real GDP in the economy being produced well short of YF here. In this case, we've got a deflationary gap, and increase in aggregate demand do not necessarily lead to sustained increases in the price level. It all depends on the current level of aggregate demand and the initial equilibrium level of output. So where aggregate supply equals aggregate demand. So we can get an increase in aggregate demand. Governments can cause an increase in aggregate demand by boosting spending without any corresponding increase in the price level. No inflation whatsoever. So at low levels of aggregate demand, such as when the economy is in a recession, an increase in AD increases national output and employment, but at this point here there's no effect on the price level whatsoever. And the Keynesians argued that the government, by increasing government spending, can boost real GDP, national incomes and output to YF without any significant or damaging increases in the price level, without inflation being at an unacceptable level. So here we have aggregate demand a little bit closer to YF than the last time we looked. Increases in aggregate demand up to where AD equals the long run aggregate supply, which equals YF. This will all cause a small but acceptable, perfectly acceptable sustained increase in the price level. So small levels of inflation. So the government boosted aggregate demand up to YF. There would be an increase in the price level, but it would be an increase that was acceptable. Low levels of aggregate demand, such as when an economy is in a recession, an increase in AD increases national output and employment, and it, in this case, has a relatively small and acceptable effect on the price level. In the third instance, the government has no cause to be trying to increase aggregate demand. Any attempt to increase aggregate demand past this point, past the full employment level of output, has no effect whatsoever. So if the economy is producing at YF already, aggregate demand equals aggregate supply at YF, there's going to be large and unacceptable sustained increases in the price level, no effect on employment at this point here. Any attempt to boost aggregate demand past this point just results in large-scale price level increases, which will be very damaging for the economy. So at high levels of aggregate demand, at long-run equilibrium of full employment level of output, an increase in aggregate demand has no effect on national output and employment. The only thing it does is produce a large and unacceptable increase in the price level. So a central statement here: the effect of increased expenditure on the level of real output and average prices depends on the level of spare capacity an economy has. At low levels of aggregate demand, there is little to no effect on the price level. However, as aggregate demand continues to increase, then so too do inflationary pressures in the economy, those price level increases. Okay, turning our attention to the effects of additional expenditure or components of aggregate demand in the economy. We term it marginal propensity to consume. It's such a mouthful, just MPC, and this is just a measurement that puts a number, it quantifies how much consumption will increase. And it's all based on the fact that consumer spending increases when there's an increase in income. So aggregate demand, we know, equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Consumer spending increases. How much does consumption change when household income changes? We know that increases in income are going to boost consumption. So how much does overall consumption change when household income changes? And this is important because the level of household income is by far the most significant determinant of the level of consumption expenditure or aggregate demand in the economy. C is the biggest component of aggregate demand. And Keynesians attempt to boost aggregate demand and therefore employment. They need to know how much any increased income will affect consumption expenditure and this aggregate demand. We have a formula for it. MPC equals a change in consumption over a change in income. So for example, we've got households' average income increasing from $2,500 to $3,000. Their expenditure on domestically produced goods and services, so those not including imports, increases by $300, and the MPC calculation becomes 300 divided by 500, which gives us an MPC of 0.6. What does this mean? This means that in this particular increase in income for this particular household, for every $1 in extra income that they receive, 60 cents is then spent on domestically produced goods and services, and the other 40 cents is either saved or spent on imported goods and services. And if we take a look at that on the scale of the whole economy, then we're talking about the average propensity to consume. So to assess the effects of an increase in income over the whole economy, governments calculate the APC of an increase in income spent by households. And APC assesses the effect of increased national income on the purchase of domestically produced goods and services, i.e. excluding those that are imported. The formula, APC equals consumption over income. And just running through a quick example, if the country has a national income of 150 billion, so we're talking real GDP there, and an average propensity to consume of 0.65, then our APC calculation becomes 0.65 equals consumption divided by that $120 billion. Consumption equals 0.65 times $120 billion. So that is $78 billion in this case. The marginal propensity to consume is affected by three variables: marginal propensity to tax, to save, and to import. The MPT is a proportion of household income that's taxed by the government. Some of this government revenue is returned to the circular flow through government expenditure. Government takes tax away and it uses that tax to purchase goods and services. It uses it for transfer payments. So G does increase with tax. And all things being equal, MPC falls as MPT increases. The MPS is the proportion household income saved by households. That's income not spent on goods and services. So some savings are used by households to repay debt, such as paying off the credit card, paying down the mortgage. Savings are withdrawal from the circular flow of economic activity and income. We know that. Households save with banks, and banks then lend some of this money to firms to finance their investment in capital goods, aka investment. An investment, we know, is an injection that boosts economic activity. If we increase investment, we get an increase in aggregate demand. Banks are going to pay for interest on savings deposit, and interest is a reward for saving, household saving with banks. Marginal propensity to import, MPM, is a proportion of additional household income spent on imported goods and services by households. So that's income not spent on domestically produced goods and services. Spending on imports is a withdrawal from the circular flow model of income and expenditure, and this particular withdrawal does not result in any sort of increase injection as a flow-on effect, as do savings or taxation, which result in increased investment or increased government spending respectively. Now, all things being equal, as MPC falls, MPC will fall as MPT increases, MPC falls as MPS increases, and the marginal propensity to consume will also fall as MPM increases. Now, all household income is spent on domestically or imported goods and services, or taxed or saved. That's all households can do with it. They can buy, they can save, or they can give something to the government. So the marginal propensity to consume plus MPS plus MPT plus MPM is equal to 1. And the marginal propensity to withdraw, MPW, accounts for all the withdrawals that occur in the circular flow model of income and expenditure. So we're talking taxes, saving, and spending on imported goods and services. So the marginal propensity to withdraw equals MPS plus MPT plus MPM. And if we take MPC, marginal propensity to consume, add the marginal propensity to withdraw, we get a figure of 1. And any increase in MPW causes MPC to decrease. Which all takes us to the Keynesian multiplier. Increased government expenditure increases aggregate demand. We know that. Increase G, we increase AD. And that's an injection into the circular flow model of income and expenditure. But increased government expenditure does not just increase government spending. It's also likely to boost consumption and investment expenditure, and that further increases aggregate demand. More bang for your buck. As a government increases spending on health and education, for example, building new classrooms, schools and hospitals, new capital goods purchase, computer equipment, medical equipment, etc., and more teachers, nurses and administrators get on the payroll, firms employed in construction and supplying school and hospital equipment will have increased revenues and profits, and they're going to increase investment. The additional jobs created will boost household incomes, and consumption expenditure will increase. So, Increase in government expenditure does not just lead to an increase in aggregate demand, but it also leads to a double boost. Increase in government spending will lead to increases in consumption spending by consumers and investment spending by firms, and that will additionally impact aggregate demand, driving it even higher. And here we come to the key formula that you need to know. The multiplier, the Keynesian multiplier, is equal to 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, or the multiplier equals 1 over those withdrawals, the marginal propensity to save, marginal propensity to tax, marginal propensity to import. Right, for an example here, let's run you through a calculation. The government decides to embark on a national roading infrastructure development to fix the nation's crumbling highways, tunnels and bridges. The government expects that this will cost around 4.5 billion euros. Now we call this autonomous expenditure. It's new expenditure that's making its way into the circular flow. MPC has been calculated to run at 0.5. MPT at 0.1, MPS at 0.2, and the marginal propensity to import at 0.2. So if we add all of these together, we get a marginal propensity to withdraw, 0.1 plus 0.2 plus 0.2 ends up at 0.5. And from the multiplier, our formula, 1 over 1 minus the MPC gives us 1 over 1 minus 0.5, the multiplier is 2. So for every dollar spent by the government here with the $4.5 billion infrastructure spending, it's going to double that amount in increased aggregate demand. So essential statement, any increase in households' marginal propensity to consume will increase that multiplier. And the higher the MPC, the greater the total increase in national income that results from higher levels of government spending. We need to understand the Keynesian multiplier in line with our Keynesian aggregate demand, aggregate supply model.